When Garrett awoke, he found himself in a dimly lit room. He struggled to move, but found that his hands were strapped down in front of him. From what he could tell, he was in the grips of a chair of some kind. The thief tried to stand, but both of his legs were cuffed in heavy iron shackles. A wave of fear suddenly washed over him. Was this the end? How was he going to get out of this mess? As he writhed, a familiar click-clack of a walking cane found his ears. Garrett flinched. He knew exactly who it was.
Good morning, Rat King. Did you sleep well?
The thief-taker general emerged into the sickly yellow light. Garrett glowered up at him from his bonds. The general's eyes were filled with the volatile mixture of wicked malice and unspeakable cruelty. Garrett didn't answer him, which didn't bother his captor in the slightest.
You're not much of a talker, are you, Garrett?
He leaned forward on his cane, staring pensively at the thief.
In fact, the only time I think you've ever spoken to me before tonight was when you humiliated me back at the whorehouse. What was it you told me again? Be nice to the ladies? Or something like that.
He twirled at his moustache again.
Something like that, yes.
Garrett grumbled. The general's eyes suddenly became alive with fiery lust.
Who was that delightful little filly you had with you that night? I'd be more than happy to be nice to her.
The general grinned knowingly.
After you're hung tomorrow.
Garrett's eyes narrowed at the taunt.
Sorry, General, but she has standards.
He replied coolly. The general feigned a hearty laugh, but then abruptly rammed his cane into Garrett's fresh injury. The bone crunched under the heavy strike, and blood trickled free as the general twisted his tool of torture into Garrett's flesh. Garrett's hazel eye filled with uncontrollable tears, and the veins in his throat tensed at the unexpected trauma. The general smirked with malevolent pleasure as his loud, unending melody of pain filled the room. Guinevere's teeth clenched in time to Garrett's agonized cry. She guessed that her thief might require some assistance in his rescue, and despite her mentor's heartfelt orders, she had come to make sure. But the young woman's worry had turned out to be well-founded indeed. She had initially planned on simply following Garrett around, undetected. But now, upon surveying the scene, watching that bastard's torture, her eyes blazed like wildfire as her most deep-rooted hatred was unleashed. Emerging from the shadows, Guinevere gave a throat-shattering roar. Through a red haze, Garrett looked up to meet her gaze. His heart nearly stopped.
Guinevere, what?
Before he could think to scold her for disobeying his orders, or warn her to stay back, the thief-taker general's eyes locked with hers. Guinevere stood, her posture tense, every part of her body screaming challenge to the fool who had dared hurt her thief. The general gave a bemused snicker.
Ah, and this must be the Queen then. So it would seem that I've captured a pair of rats within my little trap.
He thought his quip rather clever, oblivious to just who the young woman before him truly was, or what she was capable of. Her burgundy lips parted, and in a tone which Garrett had never heard out of her before, a single sentence emerged.
Let
him go.
The general boomed with laughter. Throwing his hands in the air, he chortled some more, and stepped towards Guinevere. Having constantly bared witness to this man's sadism, Garrett screamed after her.
Guinevere, get out of here!
However, his words fell on deaf ears. His young apprentice was now lost in a place where he could never contact her, never reach her, never warn her.
Such bold vermin ilk!
He held out his crossbow to her chest, and Garrett felt his blood run cold.
Guinevere! Such a pity!
The general chuckled with a sigh.
You're such a pretty...
Guinevere was now tightening her fists, her every hair standing on end. Unbeknownst to the two men before her, an ancient magic was now weaving its way through her veins. And it was a power which would slander and shame any of her previously revealed abilities. For this was beyond mere spells and hexes. The energy which now consumed her person was the power of a deity. The general squinted his eye, his finger stroking the trigger. Garrett called out to her in one last moment of desperation.
Guinevere, get out of here! You should have listened to your king. Adieu.
The thief-taker general blew Guinevere a mocking kiss, lined up his mark, and pulled the trigger. The projectile whizzed through the air at undetectable speed. Garrett closed his eyes, not wishing to watch Guinevere meet her untimely demise. The young woman wasted no time. In an instant, she reacted. Bolting to the side with an inhuman speed, Guinevere sunk to her knees. The thief-taker general gawked at her trick, temporarily rendered speechless. It was all the time Guinevere needed. With energy as old as the world itself, her body began to twist and reshape. Thick verdant vines crept around her arms and legs, slowly inching their way up her body, and leafy vegetation began to sprout out of her back, followed by her thighs and arms. Her delicate facial features became distorted and ugly, as the bark-like maw and powerful thorny jaws of the monster she was becoming became obvious. Her small ears lengthened and sprouted soft downy moss, while her green eyes became a mystical swirl of yellow and deep celadon. Her long slender hands sprouted flora and vines, followed by long deadly wooden claws. A rooted tail protruded out of her leather pants, growing vegetation and leaves, until it tapered down her back into a plume of lush ivy leaves and tiny flowers. The rest of her clothing ripped away as Guinevere reached the end of her transformation. She tore off the last shreds of her clothing, and then howled at the mortified general. Guinevere reared up, her great wooden paws slamming hard against her victim's shoulders. The weight of their impact knocked the general off his feet, and pounded his skull into the hard floor. Blood splattered in all directions. He frantically reached for his crossbow, as the lion-sized paws continued to come crashing down upon him. Guinevere's body hammered in place, and the general was left helplessly staring up into the horrifying ancient eyes of a monster. A monster which he had foolishly provoked. Guinevere snarled, her 2-inch fangs bared. The weak saffron light glinted off their igneous surface, and highlighted the horrified expression of her victim. Guinevere gave a blood-curdling roar, as the general managed to thrust one of his bolts into her right thigh. The sudden pain prompted her to react. With wild tenacity, Guinevere's great maw opened around his upper torso. In one brutal, slicing motion, the scissor-like thorns came together through flesh, bone and organ. Her bite had been clean, but it had not been a complete separation. And certainly not enough to kill instantly. The thief-taker generally emitted an inhuman shriek as unimaginable excruciation blew up inside his head. Still very much alive, he writhed and twitched in agony. The last thing the general saw were his intestines sprawled out before his very eyes. Guinevere regained her true form, and hesitantly approached Garrett. Due to the transformation, she was now nude. But the thief's mind was too consumed with terror to register upon her supple flesh. Guinevere sensed this, and her own fear doubled that of the thief. Would he love her? How could he possibly? After green light buzzed from her fingers, slicing effortlessly through Garrett's shackles and straps. Guinevere sank to her knees and watched him stand. She closed her eyes, ashamed of what she had just done. No man could love such a beast. Not even one as wonderful as her thief. Filled with this epiphany, the young woman began to quietly sob.
Guinevere.
Garrett's smoky voice called out to her. Guinevere jumped, then met his gaze. Eyes glassy and wide. The thief before her didn't know quite how to react to what he had just witnessed. He had always known that the girl had a secret. But this...
Garrett, please. I can explain.
She blurted, desperate not to lose him. Garrett remained solemn, never even blinking. Guinevere continued to watch as his face remained still. Her eyes flooded with tears. He hated her. Ashamed, she let her head drop back down, waves of auburn falling in front of her face. As she mourned her loss, a sudden warmth found her shoulders. Looking to the sides of her body, the young woman was surprised to find the thick cloak draped around her shoulders. Guinevere looked up at Garrett, who was still watching her.
You should bring a change of clothes if you're going to do that,
he remarked. The young woman's eyes began to sparkle. He was smiling down at her, with utmost sincerity.
Then you don't think that I'm an abomination?
No. Why would I think that?
Because I...
Used yet another spell? Trust me, I'm used to it by now.
Garrett, that wasn't a spell,
she proclaimed. At first, the thief thought that she was joking, and he smirked. But when her posture remained oddly serious, His initial assumption was proven very wrong.
It wasn't.
He told himself, as if reaffirming this new set of information.
Well then, what the hell did I just see?
Guinevere sighed and readied herself. She exhaled and began to speak.
I'm not really a human, Garrett. At least not in the way you think. Not entirely. This might sound crazy to you, but my mother, she was a forest nymph.
The thief's eyes widened at her confession. He had met a forest nymph many years ago, named Victoria.
That's not so hard for me to believe, Guinevere. I've met a nymph before you.
The young woman looked up, her eyes now swimming with salty tears.
You don't have to believe me. That's fine. But please don't patronize me, Garrett.
She sniffed.
I wasn't. Her name was Victoria.
Guinevere gasped. Her tears collected on the floor before her like blood, and her chest began to palpitate. Without her realizing, a firm yet comforting hand found her feverish cheek. The young woman looked up to meet an intense gaze of hazel and silver, fire and ice.
You once asked me how I lost my eye. Do you remember? It was due to her, in part. She was working for a demon at the time, and he used my eye for a pagan ritual. Victoria was the one to claim it for him.
Garrett felt a rush of cold wash over him. He had never told anyone the truth about his eye, not even Barso.
She took your eye?
Guinevere was speechless. It didn't make sense. She turned away from her thief. No, that was impossible. Garrett had to be lying to her. But a part of her knew that he would never do anything to mislead or betray her. He was her mentor, her guide through this crazy world, her beloved thief. Even when he had disliked her with a vengeance, even when it would have been so much easier to leave her to die, Garrett had remained loyal to her, to their teacher-student relationship, a relationship that had grown into something far more precious and cherished.
Yes.
He squeezed his eyes tightly closed. The memory of that horrible ritual, of that horrible night. The thief was no stranger to fear. But over his years of apprenticeship under the keepers, Garrett had learned to channel fear and adrenaline into a drive that would only forward his endeavors. He had been taught that all fears were composed of everyday occurrences. A very true statement. Even the worst of fears, of death, torture, and denial, as frightening as they were still just everyday occurrences, and they could be avoided, or in the case of death, at least postponed. But what he had witnessed that night with Victoria and Constantine, or as he was truthfully known, the trickster, that was not an everyday occurrence. That was the reveal of an ancient demon and an untamed nature spirit, watching as the old man's face contorted into an animalistic beast, being flung several feet and then pinned and ripped in two by the limbs of a forest nymph. That was perhaps the most frightening moment of Garrett's entire life.
I don't understand. Why would she?
Garrett snapped back to the present as he noticed the young woman trembling under his cloak. her tears resumed.
Why would she do that to you?
Victoria was above human reasoning. To her, all that mattered was protecting the old ways. She would have done anything to keep her forest alive, to protect it from the age of metal.
His mind screamed at him again. He knew this fact all too well, for Garrett had watched her do it. She had paid the ultimate price to save what she believed in, what she lived for, what she loved. Guinevere stopped weeping, and with a cold glare of unspeakable loss, she screamed at him.
I know that, Garrett! She was my mother!
Garrett's eyes widened.
Your mother?
Yes!
Why didn't you tell me this sooner?
Because...
Guinevere stood, letting his cloak fall from her body. Garrett quickly averted his eyes.
You never asked. Besides, it's not like you would have believed me.
You're probably right.
Garrett grunted, fighting to slow the flow of blood to his hardening groin. Guinevere took up some stray pieces of fabric from the lining of her destroyed outfit and approached Garrett. The thief was in shock, following his student's dramatic secret. He barely felt as Guinevere began to dress his wound. A few bones in his hand had been broken by the thief-taker general's torture, but it was nothing that Guinevere didn't know how to fix. As the young woman worked, a sudden revelation crossed Garrett's weary mind. He had slept with Victoria, and Guinevere was only half nymph. He stared at her through the corner of his eye. Was there even the slightest possibility? A foreign sensation flooded his senses. Garrett wasn't certain what it was. He hadn't felt it before. But whatever it was, it only seemed to grow worse the more he thought about the possibility of Guinevere being his daughter.
So, Victoria was your mother then?
Yes. I can't believe you actually knew her.
Garrett scoffed. If that wasn't the biggest understatement of the year. A sickening coldness overtook him. If the young woman was his child, what would that mean? Had he unwittingly done the unthinkable with his own blood? Were his feelings for her even valid anymore? He looked down at his feet, hiding a mortified grimace from her. That's when he noticed the green, sappy blood pooling at his apprentice's feet.
Guinevere, what's happened to you?
What do you mean?
You're bleeding.
Curiously, her green eyes followed the direction Garrett was pointing. Upon eyeing the sappy fluid, the young woman gasped. She hadn't even pulled free the bolt yet, but her injury oozed profusely. Her eyes widened. Man-made weapons were her only weakness, the only real threat to her. If she didn't get that accursed object out of her flesh, and quickly, she would be asking for unspeakable realms of trouble. Frantically, she reached down to retrieve the projectile.
No!
Garrett's firm warning halted her progress.
But it's...
Guinevere, listen to me.
He yelled, in a voice bordering on panic.
You've lost too much blood already. That bolt, it's the only thing keeping life inside of your body. If you take it out...
Guinevere's pupils dilated. How could she have been so foolish?
Garrett...
she began. Just when she considered her debt paid, Garrett had done it again. Her thief had once again saved her life. Consumed by deep passion, she started to take a step forward. Then, she stopped. The injury to her thigh suddenly felt strange. With a trembling hand, she reached down to touch her blood. Bringing the hand up to her face, Guinevere gasped. The once yellow sap had begun to taint into a sickly dark green. Seeing this, a flustered Garrett spoke to her.
Why did it change like that?
Guinevere looked into his eyes, and her vision began to swim and cloud. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her breath was shallow at best, and heavy with a noxious heat. As her eyes began to close, she fell to her knees.
Garrett.
She wheezed.
Guinevere!
He bolted upright, ready to aid her. With one final defeated sigh, her body slumped forward, Garrett barely managing to catch her. He felt his eyes widen at the sight of her. He squatted and pulled her twisted body into his lap. Guinevere gasped for air and Garrett felt her body relax. She opened her eyes and smiled weakly at her beloved teacher.
Thank you, Garrett.
Shh. Don't try to speak.
He instructed. The distraught thief watched her as she struggled to inhale and exhale. He had known that she was hurt very badly, but because it was internal, Garrett wasn't able to see the true extent of her damage. Such as the blood-thinning poison that now coursed through her veins, steadily killing her. His mind was racing. He had been through so very much in his lifetime, and this was indeed the first time in which the wily rogue had ever felt so helpless. He knew that he had to somehow get her out of here, and to his clock tower. But with the city watch, that would be no easy task. And even if he managed to succeed, how was he going to treat her? A wanted man couldn't simply walk into a medical clinic, missing Simmons' daughter in tow. Garrett looked down into her soft face, and stroked her overheated forehead. A primal and agonizing terror shook his bones, causing him to shiver.
Guinevere, what am I going to do? Just when I was... Am I going to truly lose you now?
That's when his exhausted mind finally remembered. There was a miracle tonic that he had stolen for a client during the week that Guinevere had been living on her own. It was said to cure any ailment. Garrett had never put much trust in modern medicine, and the idea of using Guinevere as a guinea pig caused his stomach to churn. But it was his only chance at saving her life, and he had to take it. Giving a decisive nod, the thief pulled as hard as he could. He winced as the fire reignited within his injured hand. He clenched his teeth and tried again. But with his broken hand and shattered digits, it was hopeless.
Garrett. Here.
Guinevere offered. Extending her hand to his, a soothing green light wrapped its way around the injury. The thief gasped as he watched his injury heal. But relief was replaced by discomfort as he watched his wound begin to appear upon her own hand. Garrett was speechless. She was absorbing his pain.
Guinevere, enough. You've already taken more than enough damage.
He ordered, but she refused to listen.
You always were such an arrogant Taffer, Garrett. someone help you for a change.
She smiled her wild grin. Garrett shuddered as he watched her hand distort into a broken, bloody pulp. It was almost unbearable as he watched the agony illuminate within her fading emerald eyes. Guinevere suddenly convulsed and allowed her brutalized hand to fall away, leaving the thief's torn glove behind, flawless flesh underneath. Then, with one final weak lurch, the nymph wrapped her arms around his back and neck.
My Guinevere.
Garrett fought back tears of empathy and desperation as he lifted Guinevere from the filthy stone floor. His posture stiffened when he noticed that her body was growing cold and hard, like the bark of an ancient tree.
Stay with me, Guinevere. You're going to make it.